Today on Plain Truth, we get the backstory of all of Israel's enemies. Stand by. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Plain Truth Podcast. I am your host, Steve, and we are back for another edition of Plain Truth, picking up right where we left off last time. We are in Genesis chapter 10. We're going to begin in verse 1. This passage is known as the Table of Nations. What we see in Genesis chapter 10, beginning in verse 1, is an outworking of a comment that was made back in chapter 9 in verses 18 and 19. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. We got his villain backstory last week. And then in verse 19 of chapter 9, these three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Now in chapter 10, we get that dispersion, and what we have is the descendants outlined for each of these three sons of Noah. So beginning in chapter 10, verse 1, these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. Verses 2 through 5 detail the sons of Japheth. I want to pick it up in verse 6. We talked about Ham last week, one of Noah's sons, and his grievous sin that he committed last time. And I'm just going to read a little bit about his descendants, beginning in verse 6 of chapter 10. The sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Raama, and Sabteka. The sons of Raama, Sheba, and Dedan. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city. Egypt fathered Ludum, Anamim, Lahabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrasim, and Casluhim, from whom the Philistines came, and Caphtorim. Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, and the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Arkites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. Afterward, the clans of the Canaanites dispersed, and the territory of the Canaanites extended from Sidon in the direction of Gerar, as far as Gaza, and in the direction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, as far as Lasha, or Lasha, if you want to pronounce it that way. These are the sons of Ham by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. Okay, so why did I spend all the time on Ham? Well, because we looked at his story last time, and in chapter 9, verses 18 through 27, we learned something of the character of Ham, and it is a wicked character that he displays. He is of the evil one. We learned back in Genesis chapter 3 that we will either see those that are of the seed of the woman, that is, they are those that call out to the living God, the one true living God, and him alone, or they are of the seed of the evil one and are rebellious to God. All of humanity is born in that condition, but God, in his grace and mercy, will draw a remnant out of fallen humanity. We see that pattern throughout the scriptures, and one who displays wickedness and is completely given over of the seed of the evil one. Sin has crouched at the door of his heart, and he is given over completely to it, is Ham. His character is revealed in his wicked actions. And so I just read for you Ham's descendants. And the reason why is, if you know your Old Testament a little bit, what you're going to see is that Ham's descendants largely comprise all of Israel's enemies. You see in there Egypt and the wicked Sodom and Gomorrah are descendants of Ham. There's an interesting comment back in verse 8 of chapter 10 where this fellow named Cush is described as fathering a man named Nimrod. He's the first on the earth to be a mighty man. And you might remember the last time we saw language and heard language like that was back in Genesis 6, where the sons of God were spoken of in that way. And these are tyrannical kings and rulers who are authoritarian in their nature. And he founds Babylon, and Assyria. So we can see that the descendants of Ham take after Ham himself, okay, and they become Israel's enemies in the future. In chapter 10, beginning in verse 21, we get the descendants of Shem detailed. And there's an interesting comment here in verse 25. The descendants of Shem will play a large role moving forward, in that Shem will father the line of that brings forth Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and of course Israel. So we'll pick up his story next time. But there's an interesting comment made in verse 25 of chapter 10 with regard to his descendants. In verse 25, we read, "To Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. And his brother's name was Joktan." So this is another comment in the midst of all of these lists of descendants of these three sons of Noah. And that's interesting because we believe that that division comment is referring to chapter 11, where I want to take you to now in Genesis chapter 11. And we're just going to look at 9 verses today. And this passage is known as the Tower of Babel. And the important thing about the Tower of Babel is this becomes the third and final rebellion in the introduction to the whole biblical story. If you take chapters 1 through 11 to comprise the introduction to the whole of the biblical story, this is the final event, and it's another rebellion. We've had 3 rebellions up to this point. The first being the fall in the garden, where Adam rebelled. And then in Genesis chapter 6, we had a heavenly rebellion. Chapter 3, an earthly rebellion. In chapter 6, a heavenly rebellion where the sons of God come into the daughters of men and create that whole mess, which leads to the flood judgment. And now we have a third rebellion following the flood, when humanity conspires together to rebel once more against God. Let's read that text, Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9. "Now the whole earth had one language in the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had brick for stone, and bitumen or bitumen for mortar. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" So we can see, beginning in verse 1, that this event that's being detailed for us here preceded chapter 10. Chapter 10 and chapter 11 are not in strict chronological order. Chapter 10 sort of flows out of this event here in chapter 11. And what happens is God had once again given the commands to humanity to be fruitful, to subdue the earth, to fill it, to multiply it, to move out and populate the whole earth. And we can see what happens is people rebel against that, and they say, let's stick together. We're not going to do what this command that's been handed down to us. We're not going to carry this out. We're going to build a name for ourselves. We're not going to glorify God in His name. We're going to build a name for ourselves. We're not going to image God and reflect His glory to the creation. We're going to build a name for ourselves, and we're going to build this, what ends up being probably most likely a ziggurat, like a temple structure, and we're going to build it to the top of the heavens. In other words, we are God. We are going to create our own laws and find our own way. And wouldn't you know it, this is mankind's problem since the very beginning. This is again the fall revisited, right? Where they ignore the commands of God, and they say they will be a law unto themselves. And look at verse 5. The Lord has to come down to see the city and the tower. This great feat of building that they're going to do, and the Lord has to come down to visit judgment upon this. A little tongue-in-cheek play on words that the Lord has to come down to view this great feat of man. And the Lord says to this, he says, "Behold, they are one people and they have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them." It says an awful lot about humanity's ability to actually carry out their plans, okay, what they desire to do, their creative endeavors. They can do lots of things. And God says if these people in their fallen, wicked condition, in their corrupted state, if they're allowed to continue to gather together in these cities like they are, they will be up to no good, and they will accomplish it rapidly and effectively and efficiently because they're all together working towards that end. So the Lord has to scatter them. And the plan that he hatches is very ingenious. What he does, they got one language, they're speaking together, they're able to communicate and carry out these purposes. So what we're going to do is we're going to confuse their language. Verse 7, "Let us go down there and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech." And so what happens? The Lord dispersed them through that act from over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel. Okay, so it's a little a comment that gives us the background for these cities that will stand against the Lord, Babel being one of them, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. That's why it was called Babel, right? Because their language was confused there. If you have a study note, you'll read to that end. And from there, the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So the Lord scatters. Okay, the Lord scatters these people. So it's a judgment upon them. All right, they refused to do what God had commanded, and the Lord came down and judged them. It gives us the origin of all the languages and nationalities, which we get back in chapter 10. So this third rebellion takes place. All right, and there we have the introduction to the whole of the biblical story now being completed. What do we learn up until this point? What are the applications we want to make from this text today? And up until this point, actually. The first is this. The Bible is relentless in its presentation of humanity as antagonistic toward God. There's continual rebellion going on in the creation, even down to this day, where people reject God, they ignore God, they work against God, they live contrary to the Word of God, so on and so forth. So what we want to say is this, that humanity is not basically good and in need of becoming better. You might hear this type of talk from people from time to time. It's not biblical. The minute you see the fact that humanity is not basically good and in need of some type of improvement project is that moment when you will then clearly see that God is merciful and gracious. So we're learning things about God through these stories that are being preserved for us. And one of the things we learn is God is merciful and he is gracious. This Tower of Babel project, another act of rebellion, could have led to a grand judgment upon these people. And yet the judgment has mercy bound up in it. He merely scatters the people by confusing their speech. He would have been perfectly just in ridding the earth of those who were supposed to image him, but rather image who? They image the serpent, the evil one, the adversary of God. So the Tower of Babel is yet just another example, another episode of God's grace in the midst of his judgment. I think I want to title this message today to you, Mercy in the Midst of Judgment. So in his judgment, God shows mercy. So we have Adam's rebellion, right? Remember, Adam's rebellion should have left Adam and Eve instantly judged in death, but God stays that executing hand in that moment. Death does indeed visit them, but it's not immediate. He shows mercy. He covers over their sin. He tells them in Genesis 3:15 that eventually one would come forth from the woman who will undo all of the work, the chaos that they've introduced through their sin. That's what we've been seeing, that story being worked out. We're looking for that champion each and every passage we read as we move forward. We thought Noah might be that champion. So did Noah's dad. He did bring relief to the toil of their hands from the ground, but it was through that flood judgment, right? Genesis chapter 6, we saw the second judgment, the sons of God coming into the daughters of men. God could have been perfectly righteous in judging all of humanity and wiping off all air breathers from the face of the whole earth, yet he preserves the creation in order to see that promise of Genesis 3:15 on hold, mercy in the midst of judgment there. And then after the ark episode, Noah and Ham have that issue. We have this Tower of Babel rebellion, this third of the three rebellions. And he once again shows his mercy in the midst of judgment, not by wiping these people out, but rather scattering them. So he's accomplishing his own ends in the midst of judgment. It's brilliant. Okay. What we will then see in the next chapter is another Adam figure emerge. Adam fails, Noah fails, another Adam. Now we'll see another man figure, another Adam figure emerge, Abraham. We'll read about his story next time. But what I want to do is I want to look at Moses' commentary on this Tower of Babel episode, just to give you a little bit more background here as to what's going on. In Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9, Moses, in the midst of this song speech that he gives, makes this comment in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9. He says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind. Now, when did he divide mankind? You got to go back in the biblical story, and what you come to is Genesis 11. What we read about in Genesis 10, he divided mankind. Genesis 11 gives us that division at the Tower of Babel. When he did this, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the... Now, the older translations used to read, following the Masoretic text, the sons of Israel. But the better reading and the more theologically accurate reading, the more biblical reading, is the older reading from the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, is he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. Now, who are the sons of God? Well, back in Genesis chapter 6, I made an argument that the sons of God were these heavenly beings who rebelled against God, leaving their first estate, and mixing with the daughters of men and creating this group of people in the midst of humanity, which ended up being the men of old, these mighty men, these kings which tyrannized people. The Nephilim were on the earth and back in that time. So what God does is when he gives these nations, when he disperses these nations, when he gives them over, he gives up on them in a sense to come back for them later, and he assigns them to be overseen by heavenly beings. And the Lord takes one portion from humanity, and we'll talk about this next time. He takes a descendant of Shem, Abraham, and starts over again after the Babel incident with Abraham. And what we'll come to see is that those nations turn their back on God for good. And they begin worshiping the sons of God placed over them. And these become the false gods of old and the demonic. Interesting stuff. Kind of gives us the way of looking at the world through biblical eyes, which are the eyes of reality. Well, that's all I have for us this time. I've enjoyed this conversation today. Until we meet again, I pray that the Lord bless you and keep you, make his face to shine upon you, be gracious to you. In Jesus' name. See you next time.